Hey everyone, welcome back to 51%'s Crypto Research Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy. Today I had on Xinshu, the CEO of Zilliqa. Zilliqa is branded as the scalable blockchain for high-throughput consensus computing. The project's gotten a lot of buzz recently, and it's set to launch its mainnet just this week, so this is a very timely episode. Xinshu is a very articulate speaker and covers everything you need to know about Zelicah pre-mainnet launch in 60 minutes. For those who haven't checked out 51%'s research, it's read by the top leaders in the space. We cut down the endless amount of news and info into actionable analysis released every other week. We just released our interoperability report where we argue that the majority of smaller chains will likely die off. And in part 2, we attempt to crown an interoperability winner. Add your email on 51pct.io for our alerts, or join using coupon code TOKEN for an awesome deal for the first few who sign up. Trust me, you're going to want the alert on who we crown as the winner. We put a lot of time into this report. With that, here's my conversation with Xinshu. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy. Today I'm thrilled to have on the co-founder of Zilliqa, Xinshu. Xinshu, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. So Xinshu, tell us how you got started in crypto.
Okay. I officially started to work on the blockchain technology back in 2016. At that time, I was working on this private blockchain deployments on a bond trading platform for the Singapore Stock Exchange. But of course, years before that, I was already interested in the Bitcoin technology itself, and I was even trying to mine some Bitcoins. But it was really, 2016, I started looking into the technology, building things under the hood to make a very scalable blockchain. And then after some projects for the private deployments in 2017, we felt that we're ready to launch it at a much larger scale as a public blockchain. That's how the project Zelicah got started at that time.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, for those who are unaware of the project, can you give us just your elevator pitch on what Zilliqa is?
Yeah, Zelicah is a new blockchain that provides high throughput and high security. It provides high throughput via different pieces of new or innovative technologies, especially sharding. And then on the other hand, it makes smart contracts much safer by having a new smart contract language that allows people to write their business logic into the contracts and then have sort of mathematical ways to prove certain properties will always hold. So these are sort of the two unique offerings of this new blockchain platform.
That's super interesting. And for those who follow Tezos, I think that they do a similar way of kind of testing whether or not code, through formal verification, if the code is legit or not. Is that kind of the sort of thing you guys are doing, or is it a little different?
Yeah, I think the high-level concept is probably very similar, and I'm pretty confident that the smart contract language we have called Zelicah is quite mature at this stage. Actually, we have several, example smart contracts. We have also started to verify some of these examples using Coq.
That's awesome. Well, the formal verification could save from some pretty serious accidents, right? People point to the DAO, and if that code was verified, people say that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, that's the point. Of course, by designing a new language, Zelicah, we already got the chance to, let's say, eliminate some of the known vulnerabilities, including that one in the DAO attack. But you always need to be mindful that there will be unknown vulnerabilities that nobody knows today. So that's why the framework for formal verification provides an opportunity that although programs may be buggy in some sense, and you don't need to really worry about it, because the only thing you care is that certain important properties will always hold, no matter whether you have bugs, no matter whether these bugs can be exploited by attacks.
That's super interesting. So just diving back into Zilliqa, what consensus mechanism are you guys using? You're using proof of work today?
It's slightly different from some of the consensus mechanisms in other blockchains. It's sort of a combination between proof of work and something called practical Byzantine fault tolerance. So the idea is this. Let's say we are not doing a public blockchain. We are doing a permissioned blockchain, and then there are only 10 guys who can participate in the consensus. And we know exactly who these 10 guys are. Then we can run something like PBFT, practical presenting for tolerance, is sort of a message-based protocol where everyone talks to everyone and then spread the news that like others are sharing certain pieces of information with them after several rounds of such communications, and then they will reach a consensus. So that's the high-level idea of PBFT. But if you look at Zelicah, we are a public blockchain, which means anyone can join the network, or anyone can at least try to join the network. We do not want suddenly all the bad guys to find some way to fake a huge amount of identities and then join the network, because when that happens, during this practical presenting fault tolerance process, the bad guys may outnumber the good guys, so they'll outvote all the good guys. So that's why we need to add a little bit of sort of cost for them to join the network as a new identity. So that's why in Zelicah, we will run proof of work periodically to allow any node to try to submit a result, and then if they match certain conditions, they will be able to join the network. And after they join the network, their identities are sort of already established, and then they only need to do PBFT to run the consensus for several rounds before sort of the next call for a new proof of work.
Got it. Is there, this might be a dumb question, but are there any concerns with the identities being known, or is this not like a KYC process? This is more of just testing whether or not the node is legit or not.
Yeah, when I say identities, these are not like real world identities. These are just identities given to you after you have run a successful proof of work process. So it's just a string, things like that.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And there's a ton of buzz around proof of stake today. With Ethereum switching over, Tezos implementing it, EOS, and others. Are there any plans for Zilliqa to switch over to proof of stake, or are you guys happy with what you have now with the mix between proof of work and practical Byzantine fault tolerance?
To us, this is both a technical question, but also a philosophical question. I would say at this stage, we are staying with proof of work. But you see that there are so many people who are very fascinated about proof of stake, especially delegated proof of stake, DPoS. So there are definitely very important merits in DPoS protocols, especially more recent proposals. And we are very interested in that, from the research perspective. We want to fully understand what are the fundamentals behind different DPoS protocols. And as part of the research, we may even, come up with our different insights in terms of that. But switching from POW to DPoS will be a much longer term decision we have to make over time.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. I think that there's a lot of buzz just between, it kind of solves the principal agent problem a little bit, because instead of having miners on one side and token holders on the other, you kind of have token holders as the ones securing the network. So it's definitely interesting, but I guess I see your point on why you don't need it here.
It's a very fascinating idea, I would say, So it's just like there are some challenges that need to be fully addressed, or at least need to be fully understood and acknowledged before we feel very comfortable of switching over.
Got it. Just switching back to your performance, you guys are clearly, your throughput is obviously much faster than existing blockchains. I think on your website you have something like 2,800 transactions per second, whereas Ethereum and Bitcoin are between 5 and 15. And I think you guys achieved this through sharding, which is getting a ton of buzz recently. Do you have sharding live on your network today?
Yes, it's sort of live in our testnet, and we are going to launch our mainnet next week. So I guess the version we are running now is going to be very similar to the version that we are going to launch for our mainnet. And I think we already got most of the sharding piece done several months ago.
Got it. That's interesting. I think one of the hardest parts about sharding is that communication between the different shards. And I think, Ethereum with Serenity is trying to address that, and Polkadot and Cosmos. And we just did a deep dive on interoperability, and it's kind of the crux of the argument on whether or not that can be achieved. Is that an issue for you guys, or do you have that solved now?
It's definitely a challenge for us as well. Once you are thinking along that line of sharding, there may be quite different ways when you actually shard the network, but still this sort of inter-shard or cross-shard communication is going to be a challenge. But there is some fundamental difference between our sharding mechanism and Ethereum's proposed plan of sharding, such that in the Zelicah sharding, the states are still shared across different shards. So every single node running consensus in the Zelicah network still has a knowledge of the global state. So in that sense, yes, there will still be cross-shard communications, but then the amount of cross-shard communications required for Zelicah is going to be much less compared to that in the Ethereum's new sharding scheme. So that gives us sort of some leverage. But then, of course, we are still very mindful in terms of being very efficient in dealing with even the remaining part of the cross-shard communications. That's why when we shard different things, you need to already think about the way you shard will actually determine, in some sense, how much cross-shard communications you will have to have.
Got it. That's interesting. So if we just walk through like a sample transaction, I mean, does a smart contract live on one shard in Zelicah, or are we just sharing transactions across shards? Like, what exactly happens between the shards when we have a transaction on Zelicah?
So you can look at transactions in different categories, right? You can have simple payment-like transactions. Basically, I'm sending 5 zeros to you. So these transactions are pretty easy to shard in a sense, because you can look at, let's say, the destination address, or look at both the sender and destination, and then you can actually allocate such transactions into different shards, and usually that's fine. Then that's the end of the story. The complication comes when you involve smart contracts. So these are sort of the more sophisticated cases, and we actually look at the specifics of the interactions between, let's say, a client or a user with different types of smart contracts. So sometimes we will be able to just shard a smart contract into one of the shards, but sometimes we do have to say have one of the many mechanisms to deal with the situation where when you try to process a call to a smart contract, it involves several shards. So that still happens. So there are different ways to deal with that. You can have something called, two-phase commit protocol, and you can have sort of, in our case, you have one special shard who are going to just specifically deal with all such cases where multiple shards are involved. And you can also have sort of asynchronous ways to deal with such communication requirements. For example, you can process something in one shard, and then you communicate something like a receipt or a message to other shards, and then other shards can take over in the next run and finish the processing. So there are different ways of dealing with that. In the Mainnet we are going to launch, we're taking sort of the second approach, which is that we have a special shard in our architecture called directory service shard. So this shard is going to process some of the more complicated portions of smart contract interactions.
Got it. And that main kind of shard, I mean, is that comparable to like the relay chain on Polkadot or Cosmos, or like the beacon chain on Ethereum, or is that like a main chain for you guys, or how exactly do you decide, which shard controls what? Is that more of the developer's decision, or is that that just happens on the platform automatically?
So the decision of which node goes to which shard and which transaction or which call to a smart contract goes to which shard is a protocol decision. That means it's algorithmic. So regarding your earlier question, what is the difference between this kind of sharding and multi-chain or inter-chain architecture? I think it sometimes is getting a little blurred. The boundaries can getting a little blurred, but still, when we talk about sharding, usually we mean different parts of the network, but still forming the same consistent network. So when we talk about multi-chains, so these chains may interact with each other, but let's say for whatever reason, one chain cannot talk to another chain for a day or even for a week. These parallel chains can still function as per normal. So that's sort of the more isolated model of multi-chains. But with sharding, that's not the case. If a shard cannot talk to another shard for a few weeks, then this chain basically cannot function. So there is still some qualitative difference, I would say, between multi-chain architecture and sharding within the same blockchain network.
Got it. That's super interesting. And, Xinshu, what's your take on, I don't know how in depth you guys look at this stuff, but, what's your take on Polkadot and Cosmos and these interoperability protocols? The only reason I ask is because we just wrote a deep dive on it, part 1 on it, and I find it fascinating. but I'm always concerned on whether or not these protocols can, pull off interoperability, and that kind of overlaps with sharding a lot because we're talking about different chains or different shards here. And it seems like you guys are, going to launch your mainnet with tech that seems to be working. Do you guys view these as competitors, or do you view them as, you're kind of eating their lunch now, or how do you view that?
I think interoperability between different chains is a very important problem, and it's sort of a quite orthogonal problem, I would put it, than sharding, because we are still pretty much focusing on making one chain faster. But their job is really to think about when you have multiple chains. I think we have to accept that fact, like it or not, we'll have multiple chains in the foreseeable future. How do you efficiently and securely integrate different chains? Or maybe integrating is a too strong a word. Maybe how do you let these chains interact when they need to? So these are quite different problems. Whether, let's say the fundamental technologies or mechanisms of these to solving these two problems could have some overlap, maybe. Sometimes I said the boundaries of the technologies themselves may be blurred, and one can learn from another. But the problems they are trying to solve and the deployments of these technologies are still fundamentally different. I think interoperability between chains are very important. But on the other hand, I think the whole blockchain ecosystem at the moment is sort of facing some common challenges that, to me, are more urgent to address. So, for instance, we really need to want to see wider adoptions, and want adoptions even into the mainstream industries, or just, anyone on the street who should be able to use a blockchain in some sense. So when that happens, you are really going to be burdened by issues that, things are segregated across different chains. And then interoperability will be a much more urgent issue to address at that time. But I think it's important to start looking at these, technical challenges even today, because you can't wait until then.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Well, just zooming out, do you guys consider yourself more of a competitor to public blockchains, or do you guys consider yourself more of a competitor to, say, private or consortium blockchains? When I was starting my research, I kind of saw a lot of similarities to kind of like what AWS and Microsoft are doing, just because of your throughput. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts there and where you think you guys fit in.
Oh, I think Zelicah is entirely a public blockchain. As of today, we know whether tomorrow someone can take our code, modify here and there, enhance certain features, and make it a private chain. That's another story. But as of today, Zilliqa is entirely a public blockchain. So this AWS thing is just really a deployment choice. So for example, you don't have to run our nodes on AWS. You can run it on your laptop for the CPU part. And I usually run a laptop at home just to connect to our testnet to help people diagnose. You don't have to use AWS. But if you think about the practical aspect, that as a team who is sort of testing with thousands of nodes, if you don't use a cloud infrastructure and you need to sort of buy so many machines and then somehow launch these machines and tear down these machines on a regular basis, it's just not realistic. That's why we choose AWS, because they provide very convenient ways, especially with Kubernetes. You can launch all these instances, tear them down, send files to them. We have sort of developed a whole suite of scripts to interact with all these machines in a very efficient way. So that's sort of like an operational issue. From the gist of it, anyone can potentially run a computer as long as it has enough, let's say, GPU power to run proof of work to join the Zelicah network.
Got it. And I have to ask, because there's just so much talk between the centralized cloud providers and their interplay with blockchain. Why did you guys choose AWS over, say, Microsoft or, to a lesser extent, IBM?
I would say AWS interfaces are still very convenient to use. We just sort of had no issue in developing add-on scripts to interact with this AWS infrastructure, and we really love it.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Well, one of the main questions I think people have are, what's the value proposition of using Zelicah over other public blockchains? And I think that what you're saying here is the sharding and security type factors, but, are there other trade-offs you guys are making, or do you think that you might be more centralized? I know I didn't ask how many nodes are required to run the network today, but that's always an interesting point here.
So decentralization is our goal. So we have enough number of nodes, for example. I think we have the largest number of nodes probably among the recently launched new chains. At launch of our mainnet, we are going to have 2,400 nodes. So this is sizable by itself, but I need to explain a little bit on this number. So these 2,400 nodes are going to be backed by a much larger number of GPUs, because we want to set some, reasonably secure difficulty to make sure that this proof of work network cannot easily be attacked. So these 2,400 nodes are sort of just the CPUs, and every CPU will be packed with, let's say, 50 GPUs. So that's sort of the size we're talking about. It's a quite sizable network, I would say. And on the other hand, going forward, I think this network is deemed to grow. And whenever it grows, the throughput will be even higher. So I do not think that decentralization is going to be one issue to be concerned about. But of course, if you compare Zelicah with today's most popular smart contract platforms such as Ethereum, when certain users want to compare which platforms to go with when they develop their decentralized applications, I think there can still be trade-offs, right? For example, if they want an immediate outreach to a huge amount of, let's say, retail users, then maybe Ethereum is a platform to go. But on the other hand, if they really want to build a very serious business-driven decentralized application with sort of future-proof in terms of scalability, in terms of security, I think Zelicah will be a very good choice for them.
Got it. That's super interesting. And that question was from Gregory Rocco over at the Alpine team. So I appreciate him providing that question. And Xinshu, just back to the decentralization question, you gave a great overview there. How do you think about decentralization along the other factors, though? I mean, I know that I know you hope the node base will grow into the thousands, but how do you view like the actual code being decentralized? And I know we didn't get into governance yet about how decisions are made, but how do you view the other aspects of decentralization for Zelicah?
I think it's going to be a challenge. We have to sort of acknowledge this is a challenge. This is not an achievement we already have today or next week. So for example, even from the technical perspective, when we launch this network of 2,400 nodes, we don't know how many nodes will come from the community. The team is sort of ready to spawn as many nodes as necessary to keep the basic security level of the network. And going forward, we really want to have more community nodes running the network. And on the other hand, we are going to make some more announcements on the details of these networks. So for example, there will be certain infrastructures that will be more centralized than, let's say, we would like to have in the beginning, and we need to take more time to sort of decentralize different components. And then even from the technological perspective, decentralization, all these sort of mechanisms sometimes require a lot of work. It's actually a technical innovation in making things efficient, secure, and at the same time decentralized. And then coming to this point of governance, I think this is also something that we are going to learn from other projects. I imagine that in the beginning, the Zelicah team will still have like a relatively large influence in terms of which features will get prioritized and when do we run the next, big upgrade on the protocol or things like that. But going forward, we really want to engage as much as possible the community members to join the conversation. And once the mining network becomes, very decentralized, really, the Zelicah team cannot just force or impose decisions on everyone. I personally imagine that we are probably going to be some sort of governance model like Ethereum, because at this stage we don't have plan to, let's say, let token holders have voting rights, because sometimes if you give token holders voting rights, some people will say, oh, you look like a securities token. So that's something we are very mindful of. That's why I think in the foreseeable future it's going to be some kind of community driven, discussion based, proposal-based approach like Ethereum today.
Got it. That's interesting, Xinshu. And I guess the question there is, I guess I always have a concern that it's very hard to implement governance systems after a project gets really big. 0x has a roadmap to add, actual control for token holders into their network, but they've yet to do it. And implementing, say, token holder control in Bitcoin would be extremely hard, right? So I'm just wondering, I mean, do you think that it might be really hard to implement a governance system as your network grows, or do you think that it's the right way because you don't exactly know how you want to do it yet, and it's more conservative to wait?
I would like to qualify your statement a little bit. I would agree to say that it's going to be harder and harder to implement an on-chain governance model once the network becomes bigger and more mature. But we are not aiming for on-chain governance at this stage. What I just described earlier was sort of a very, soft touch mechanism. Sometimes it's very manual. You are even supposed to meet people in person or have phone calls, just to discuss these ideas. So I think as long as we are open-minded and we always try to engage the community when we make major decisions, I also do not see that whether your network is larger or small, whether your protocol is more mature or less mature would make like a huge difference in that sense. In some sense, we are being more practical here. We also feel that if you want to implement a perfect on-chain governance protocol, it's going to be groundbreaking. It's going to be more ideal for everyone. But we just don't know how to do that at this stage.
That's super interesting. Now, your specifics make a lot more sense. And I think that's kind of the route that Ethereum is going, where they just keep everything kind of off-chain and in a more abstract kind of decision-making process, which makes a lot of sense. And, my friend Christian Kaz _ on Twitter, that's his Twitter name. He brought up a good point when I was asking him before on, keeping a team centralized, kind of like Near Protocol, which I also had on the podcast. Their goal is kind of to keep the team centralized so that they can move a lot faster and grow the network without having to, ask the network for every decision. Do you feel that Zilliqa is kind of, going the same route there?
I think it's a process. So I think in the beginning it will be very centralized. If you look at our team, let's say our physical team, in the beginning everyone was in the same small office in Singapore. Now over time we will have to expand the team to the global scale. Now we have people across different continents in different cities. That's just how it works. You can't say everyone has to come to the Singapore office. It just doesn't work if you want to attract more talents. And also I think for decision making of the let's say main milestones or priorities of the project, in the beginning it would just be maybe the Zelicah team making most of the decisions. I think over time it's just not going to be feasible for us to always make the decisions. So I see, yes, I agree that there's a trade-off between, let's say, centralization and efficiency or inefficiency. And my personal take is that in the beginning it will be more centralized and more efficient. But this thing is not going to sustain for 10 years. So over time, we have to find ways to actively and efficiently engage the community. So although the decision-making process will become less efficient in some sense, but I think that's the right way to go. Decentralization is in the spirit of blockchain.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Well, let's switch over to some of the fun stuff. You're planning to launch your mainnet next week, and you have your testnet live. So let's get into the testnet. How's the third version of your testnet going? Any issues? Any positive surprises when you're running it?
We don't really have too many surprises, I would say. So
that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, we of course would like to have a surprise that everything runs smoothly and you don't need to touch anything and just let it run. But the reality is that you always have, issues here and there, especially like we spend a lot of time working on some of the suggestions given by our different security auditing firms. So we really thank them for their very, very helpful feedback. So sometimes, their suggestions or comments are not really regarding a bug or vulnerability per se, but sometimes they say, hey, for best practice, you have to code this way. You better refactor your code a little bit. So we actually spend some time doing that as well for the recent version of the testnet. But of course, we can't finish everything. I think there's a lot of work to be done post the mainnet launch. But we try to get a version during the testnet phase. So that's going to be sort of running, and that's going to be secure. That's going to be able to sustain at least the initial traffic in that sense.
Got it. That makes sense. And is there anything new in the mainnet that you're launching next week that's not in the testnet, or is it basically the same thing?
Oh, you basically cannot have a new feature in the mainnet that is sort of not very well testing the testnet. So as our testnet keeps evolving towards a mainnet launch, eventually there will just be the same version. So actually we already had our code freeze for the mainnet launch. We have a whole list of features that I want to do or we want to do, but we have to put them on hold at the moment, because if you keep adding new features, then you will never be able to launch the mainnet. So you have to put a hard stop somewhere and say, okay, this is what we're going to launch for the mainnet. For all the other interesting features, we'll do it after the launch.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, developers always have a hard time deciding what to include and what not to include. And when you launch your mainnet, what should we expect out of the launch? I mean, is this going to be like, are there nodes ready to go here, or how's the community preparing for this launch? I know that Grin and Beam just launched, and they kind of had communities like ready to go. Supposedly, Grin had near $100 million in venture money for miners. I don't know if I believe that number, but they both got prepared pretty well for their launches.
Yeah. I think we are trying our best. For example, recently we are trying to speak with miners who might be interested in joining the initial mining network. We want to secure some reasonable amount of mining power. For the first few weeks post mainnet launch, it's going to be a bootstrapping phase, because we know this network may not be super stable. This network may be the target of potential attacks. So that's why we have this bootstrapping phase to protect the network and sort of the benefits of miners. Because once a mainnet is launched, miners will start mining, and then they will start to get rewards. But no transactions or smart contracts will be processed during this bootstrapping phase. And then after some time, I guess it will be like a few weeks, the bootstrapping phase will automatically end according to the logic we code inside the protocol. And then the network will just become like normal. So it'll have all the features we have talked about. People can send transactions, deploy smart contracts, and all these things will be processed under that sharding mechanism. And then the Zelicah smart contract language is ready, and then people can program. And if they know how to verify certain properties, they can use a formal way to verify the properties. So it's going to be like a full-fledged network after the bootstrapping phase.
Got it. That makes sense. And just a general question for you guys: how do you incentivize miners to join the network? Is the block reward similar to Bitcoin, or how exactly is that going to work on the mainnet?
At the high level, is similar. Basically, you contribute to the network, then you will get rewards. But there are also some fundamental differences. So number one is in the Bitcoin or Ethereum mining network, is about the winner taking all. So that's why people have to pull together, and then they have to contribute their own mining resources. And then once a block reward is awarded, they will divide, according to certain rules. So here in Zelicah, the reward is slightly more spread, because it's not, the winner taking all. All the nodes, let's say 2,400 nodes, eventually in the network will be able to share a portion of the mining reward for every block mined. That's one difference. Another difference is I mentioned that there are two sort of processes in the mining protocol. One is that you need to do proof of work periodically to join the network. And two is that after you join the network, you can participate in a practical presenting PBFT process to run the consensus. So we have separate mining rewards for these two aspects. If you are able to win the POW and join the network, you get a small portion. And then if you keep contributing to the several rounds of consensus, you will be able to get a bigger portion. So these are some of the differences of our mining rewards than, let's say, Bitcoin or Ethereum today.
Got it. That's interesting. And so the second part of your rewards, where block rewards are shared with the whole network, that's kind of like similar to you guys having a giant mining pool kind of built into your network to begin with, instead of where in Bitcoin people have to join mining pools to split rewards, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you have, let's say, 50 modern GPUs today, you can be a node yourself, and you will be able to get, the rewards. If you don't have 50, modern GPUs, you only have one GPU card, let's say, you probably need to group with other people to have, that minimum number of GPUs to become one node.
Got it. That makes sense. That's interesting. Well, let's go over, back to the mainnet though, when you guys launched, are you going to, I know you said that you're planning to support a lot of future or great features, which is interesting. What's on your roadmap to release in the future that won't be released in this mainnet? I know you alluded to smart contracts and stuff like that.
So there are several things. Number one is a task we already know how to do, but we just didn't get enough time to do before the mainnet. We are going to refactor our code a lot. So it's for maintainability, because if your code is structured in a nice way, it's much easier to add new features or even fix issues, things like that. That's something we're going to do. And also we are fixing many of the parameters for this mainnet launch in a very conservative way. Because we want security, we want stability, but over time we are going to sort of fine-tune many of these parameters post the mainnet launch. That's going to take some of our effort as well. And then for the Zelicah language, we are going to do a lot of enhancements, and even down the road we are going to work on compilers to convert some of the other higher level programming languages into Zelicah. So when that happens, people don't even have to learn a new language, Zelicah, while still being able to benefit from the formal verification features of the language.
Got it. That makes sense. And, the formal verification piece is really interesting, as we talked about before. How hard is this for developers to actually use? Is this like a button they click before they input their code where it checks it for errors, or is this something a little bit more in depth?
I think it's not as straightforward as just a button click, because number one is it's easier to say that you have 5 important properties and then you can verify, but you first need to summarize what are these properties that are critical. Because if you miss a very important property and then that property turns out to be a vulnerability that can be violated in a sense, then the formal verification cannot help you. So you need some expertise in terms of our understanding for this particular type of smart contracts. What are the important properties we have to verify? That's number one. And number two is that after you summarize them into important properties, you also need a way to write, let's say, cock proofs to show that these properties will hold. So these are sort of very specialized skill sets. Now, how do we help developers of smart contracts achieve such verification without having to go through all these tough steps? I think as an initial step, we are going to issue some of the template smart contracts. Just imagine ERC20, something like that will be very standardized. You don't have a lot to customize. And then if you follow our templates to write smart contracts, and then there will be a sort of a template proof that can show you, at least the basic properties will hold. Of course, if you write a very weird smart contract that nobody has seen before, then you probably need to engage an expert to help you do the verification. So that's sort of the first step. We are going to use templates to ease the process.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And, back to the developers that we're discussing here, you guys are using the Zelicah programming language. What are the differences on Zelicah from, say, Ethereum Solidity or even JavaScript, or is this a form of JavaScript? I'm just wondering what the benefits are here.
The benefits is that the language itself, number one, eliminates certain vulnerabilities, let's say the vulnerability in the DAO hack. And the second thing is it has to be designed in a certain way so that you can write formal proofs. So otherwise, what you can do is to do formal verification for Solidity programs. In theory, that's not impossible, but in practice, that's just much more difficult than having a more tightly structured language like Zelicah. So the structure of Zelicah makes it much easier to do formal verification. So that's why the syntax of Zelicah is different from Solidity. There's some similarities, but it's different. To me, Zelicah has some of the elements of the design of something called a functional language. So it's a different sort of need different type of programming language, something like OCaml or Haskell, or Scala. So these are different types of languages. Sometimes programmers of C, C++, or JavaScript may have a little bit of difficulty in writing programs in the new style. But as someone like myself, I was familiar with JavaScript. So when I look at the design and the syntax of Zilliqa, I feel like there are a lot of parallels between JavaScript and Zilliqa. I feel for JavaScript developers, learning Zilliqa is not going to be difficult. And we actually have proofs, because in our team, nobody knew what was Zilliqa because it was not even invented. But then when we hired our developers, usually they just take like 2 weeks, 3 weeks before they can easily pick up Zilliqa.
That's interesting. And are all the developers basically in-house at Zilliqa, or do you guys have a developer community outside of, say, the foundation or Zilliqa itself?
We have an in-house team, definitely. Most of the protocols are developed in-house. But when we try to enter into adoption, we are engaging different community developers as well. We have in-house app developer, but we don't have enough resources to develop many apps. We don't even have resources to develop all the wallets. So if you look at these wallets that our community has developed, they're pretty good. And I think it's our mission sort of to keep growing that kind of community developers, because eventually it's going to be a decentralized platform for people to use. It's not something like everything is on us, because that's not going to be a scalable model.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Well, let's switch to some of the even more fun stuff. Let's go to your use cases and where you guys hope to be successful. You mentioned a few on the site with gaming and advertising and payments. I'm interested, what's most interesting to you, and what are you targeting right now for use cases on Zilliqa?
Actually, if you have not noticed, we just announced a very interesting initiative today, literally today, a few hours ago. So we are partnering with a few, very good partners to work on a security token exchange. So now this brings to one interesting direction we are looking at, which is about asset-backed tokens. So we are interested in offering a tokenization platform on top of Zelicah for people to issue tokens that are backed by equities or loans, bonds, or even revenue sharing contracts. And then at the same time, we also want a venue for people to trade these assets by having a secondary market. So that's why we started working on this security token exchange project that just got announced today. So that's something very interesting, because if you look at these tokens that have a backing in the actual assets, I think they are closer to the traditional assets. People in the traditional financial services sectors are familiar with. So it could drive mainstream adoption in a very efficient way. And on the other hand, I think once you trade these assets on the blockchain, you really need something to guarantee the security of all the logic governing, the offering and trading. So that's why we think our smart contract language Zilliqa will be a very useful tool for programming such logic for security tokens. So that's one interesting direction. And as you mentioned, digital advertising definitely is also very interesting, because there indeed is a very strong use case. You have different players in this space dealing with a very high volume, huge volume of transactions regarding advertisement impressions, and then it's not very straightforward to pick just one player in the industry to say, hey, now everyone trusts you. You have all the data. We just need to deal with you. That's not very feasible. These guys definitely they work together. They are partners. They have some trust between them, but it's best to have like a platform, a transparent platform like that enabled by the blockchain to say, okay, now the 5 of you all come onto the same platform. And for data that you guys are comfortable with sharing among each other, you can put such data onto the blockchain, and things will just be much more transparent, much more efficient, and even payments between you guys can be automated by programming them into smart contracts. So that's why we are very fascinated with this partnership with Mindshare, Rubicon, and MediaMath and others. So this is really one of the kind, I think, type of use case that it has a very strong need for a platform like blockchain.
Got it. That's interesting. And just let's start with the security token exchange you guys just announced. I guess I missed it. It's early here, and I know late in your time zone. But so you guys are basically going up against not only ICOs on Ethereum, but you're up against the dozen or so security token companies out there, from Securitize all the way over to Polymath. Do you think that you guys have a real competitive advantage here, or is the point more so that you're seeing applications built on Zilliqa, and that's basically the goal for you guys here?
I think we are a technological platform. We are very open-minded. I mean, in a sense, whatever we do on the platform, others can do the same thing, or they can do different things because, it's a public blockchain. But we really want to drive the usage and adoption of the Zilliqa technological platform. So that's why we think security token is important. Now, I think this space is still very broad. It's still very nascent. I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration. I think competition is really not a concern because we also talk to all these guys you just mentioned. I think there's always a common spirit that we should work together, especially when we see different jurisdictions. We are based in Singapore. Some people are based in US. Some people are based in Europe. The reason that we want to go ahead and apply to the sandbox program here is that we think Singapore can be a hub for let's say Southeast Asia or even Asia. And I think there's a lot of interest from the investors in this region to have opportunities like this to trade, let's say, fractionalized equities. So that's sort of, basically the main consideration behind this effort.
Got it. That makes sense. And just switching over to the advertising, I mean, I'm just wondering, what are the benefits of putting, say, programmatic advertising on a public blockchain? I mean, my concern for the businesses is, is it going to be so transparent that businesses are sharing their profit margins? I feel like that might be an issue, or does it not go that deep, and more of the issue you're solving is the multiple intermediaries here?
Yeah, so I think you pointed out a very important matter, which needs to be sort of actually decided by people participating in these kind of efforts. It's not going to be a or nothing choice, whether you should put all data on the public blockchain or should put nothing. I feel that transparency is a relative term. People have to feel comfortable with the level of transparency. So I do not foresee that, the industry players putting everything about that digital advertising campaign on the public blockchain on day one. They are probably going to put data that's not even relevant to any identities, for example. But then they put just enough data so that it guarantees some transparency, some immutability of other data that they may share only among themselves. So that's my personal take on this. That's how I see this is going to work.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So I know I think there's a Seeking Alpha article where you talk about that you think in 2019 we're going to see like a wave of new use cases come out using blockchain. Do you think that it's basically set to, say, gaming and advertising and security tokens, or do you expect other use cases, beyond this?
I can't be 100% sure that what exactly are going to be, the use cases being adopted. So gaming, digital advertising, security tokens are definitely very interesting directions. But whether you are going to see massive adoptions of this in 2019 or 2020, that nobody knows. But also there can be other interesting use cases. So for example, I'm personally very interested in understanding those sort of use cases that involve communities. So this is not like the general blockchain communities. It can be a very specific closed community. Let's say people in a fan club. So nowadays they are already making contributions. They already have their own governance model, and then it's a very close knit sort of ecosystem. But they are largely doing this on a voluntary basis. But if you can find ways to say the contribution they make to that kind of community can be incentivized or can even be compensated when such contribution really makes a big deal to the entire community, I think that can be very interesting as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was reading yesterday about the ETH trader Reddit making that donut token to kind of like incentivize comments, and A lot of people thought it was a joke. I thought it was kind of interesting, but I don't know how much that was shared around.
Sorry, what was that?
It was basically a Reddit community for Ethereum. The trading community created a token called the Donut, basically with their own community. But just switching gears back to you guys. I mean, back to your network itself. You guys have your ZIL token. What exactly is the token used for in the network?
It's very similar to Ether. So you spend Ether so that you can send transactions around smart contracts on Ethereum. So here is very similar. ZIL will feel the gas fees for transactions and smart contracts on Zelicah.
Got it. And is there high inflation for ZIL tokens annually, or is it similar to Bitcoin and Ethereum around 4 to 5%?
So we have in total 21 billion tokens. So 40% of such tokens are for mining rewards. We have not, decided exactly how many tokens we are going to issue for mining rewards every year. But I think for the first year, it's going to be around 4% ballpark number.
Got it. That's interesting. Yeah, I did a Tezos deep dive and an Ethereum report on the site, and basically Ethereum's kind of trying to target under 1%, and Tezos is kind of around 5.5%. And I have concerns that Ethereum won't be able to attract stakers if they're only earning 0.5%. So I definitely think that has to be higher. So I think your goal at 4 or 5%, I think, makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, but if we do 4% every year, then 40% is for 10 years. It's very hard for us to predict closer to that 10-year end what will happen. I think we'll just start with 4%.
Yeah, that makes more sense. And just, I know we didn't talk too much about security, and that's obviously a key concern here. How do you think about security or 51% attacks, or just keeping the network safe?
Yeah, I think in general, security is one of the top concerns for any blockchain, because blockchain is perceived to be a very trusted source of information. But if security is compromised, that's going to be a big issue. That's why, when we first launched our Zelicah network, the Mainnet, we are going to be very mindful about security. We're going to be very conservative in setting certain parameters. We're going to have a lot of protection mechanisms, a lot of fallback mechanisms, always security in the center of our consideration. I think sometimes we just have no choice. We have to be very careful about it. For existing networks, yes, for proof of work based networks, 51% attack is definitely a concern. But there are also different considerations of this. So sometimes people feel that to really solve this problem, you either have like a huge hashing power in the network, or you sort of have to have a combination between a very decentralized system and some of the more centralized mechanisms just to mitigate issues or risks from 51% attacks.
Got it. That makes sense. And just switching over, I'm really interested in funding at these times because we're seeing a bear market. Some projects run out of money, or they don't really have a great way to solve funding. One of my favorite projects that attempts to solve this is Decred, which full disclosure, I own Decred tokens. Where part of their block award goes in a foundation and token holders vote on that. I have an analysis on the site on this, but it looks like you guys, I don't know if this is accurate, but on your Masari page, I saw your wallet. It looks like you guys have $1 million in Ether left. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but how do you think about long-term funding for the project?
So we have enough funding for the project for the next few years. That's what we raised for. We raised about 22 million USD to fund the projects for several years to fully develop the platform, as well as have enough sort of resources to drive adoption. So we are still like that in a sense. Although the overall market conditions are different, these conditions do not necessarily affect our runway. But of course, under different market conditions, people may have different sentiments when we try to drive adoption, especially mainstream adoption onto the blockchain. If people keep thinking that this is just a bubble, that has just bursted, that's of course going to make life a little difficult for everyone, including us. But otherwise, we are not really affected.
Got it. That makes sense. And just closing out, two last questions for you. I mean, what are the main issues that you get from the community? Like, what's the pushback that you get about Zelicah that you have a hard time answering, or you can't answer yet? I'm interested in what the bears are saying about Zelicah.
So I think in general, our community has been very, very supportive. And I sometimes, because I talk to other projects, I heard, how they sort of interact with other communities. But I think our interactions with our community have been really, really very healthy. But of course, sometimes some community members do feel a little bit, impatient in terms of progress. But I also feel that building a new blockchain from scratch, not really, leveraging our existing code base, is a very tough journey. We have to sort of work very closely with the community and be together just throughout the journey. So that's something we're trying to help some of the community members to understand, because we are here, we are very committed. It's just like sometimes developing difficult technologies take a little bit of a while.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean that's to say, though, building new blockchain is one thing, but there's projects out there that are looking to completely rebuild their blockchains as well. I own tokens in Ether, full disclosures on the show notes, but with Serenity, they're starting from scratch as well. But back to you guys. Is there anything that I forgot to ask you, Xinshu, or anything you want to talk about? I know we were all over the place, but my goal is to get all the info I can in an hour.
I think it's good to be all over the place. It's been a quite comprehensive conversation. I do not have anything to add.
That's awesome. Well, Xinshu, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and best of luck with the Mainnet.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the podcast. Please rate, review, and share the podcast to help other people find it. And be sure to visit 51pct.io and enter your email to get our research alerts delivered directly in your inbox.